on Moses, looking at we have looked at several different things we learn about leadership from Moses. There's so many of these. I've even thought of a few extra that I could add, and some of them I felt like maybe it overlapped a little too much. I started to add those in, and I thought, well, I think some of that we've covered in other lessons. Some of these are just sort of general things that we learn from other passages, other examples of leadership as well, not just necessarily from Moses' life. I'll tell you one thing that I have learned about leadership, at least in the form of leading the congregation in a study of God's Word, is that, of course, I knew this before as well, but you can't please everybody. It was just, I think it was last Sunday, one of my sons said, "You're not still doing that Moses stuff again, are you?" I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I am." And then the other son said, "Oh, good. And I got a good set of notes going on that. I'm looking forward to, kind of finishing that out or whatever." And then, of course, today, same scenario played out. "Wait, what? Are you still not done with that?" And then the other one says, "Oh, good. I'm glad to hear we're doing that again." So, you can't please everybody. That's something that you learn looking at the Bible and just common sense, anecdotal experience. Even Jesus did not please everybody. I was thinking about that. You could be the sinless. Obviously, none of us will ever be sinless, but even the sinless Son of God never did anything wrong, never even thought anything wrong, and yet still did not please everyone. And so when we wrap this series up in the next 20 to 25 weeks, I'll understand I can't please everybody. I'm just kidding. We're going to wrap it up tonight. Okay, Levi, we're wrapping it up tonight. So I did want to mention at the outset here, several people have asked me, knowing that Reagan and her family used to live in Ukraine, and I was also thinking about this because a lot of these great characteristics, or these characteristics of a great leader that we see from Moses, you see in the president of the Ukraine. I mean, he has shown tremendous leadership in the midst of a terrible, terrible situation, and you see two diametrically opposed mentalities when it comes to leadership. One, and you got Vladimir Putin, who doesn't seem to care about the troops that he sends into harm's way, doesn't care about civilians, and just decides, this is what I want, I'm going to go, I'm going to take it. And just a selfish, self-centered style of leadership versus a man who, at least last I had heard, had remained in his country, understanding the dangers that poses, but that's leadership. I'm in it with you. And man, I told somebody the other day, I said, you know what, I wish we had leadership like that in our country. I don't take for granted that we live in a country that is still in many ways the best country in the world. But boy, to have leadership like that would be nice. And hopefully we can regain leadership like that at some point. But you see two very different styles. But some people had asked, and I knew I get some things talking to Reagan after she's talked to her parents, and I've heard a few things here and there, so I finally took the time last week to just call Papaw and talk to him and get some more details, and also for our elders here, because they had asked about what we might be able to do to help through that, because Brother Roger, preaching for the Greens Lake Road congregation in Chattanooga, they have sent some funds. Roger and Donna have sent some funds personally, but they do that through the church there at Greens Lake Road. The Greens Lake Road, ever since going back to before I was working there as one of their associates, they have supported a man named Sergei Boykev. He's about 4 hours south of Kiev, and Papa has spoken to him, and Sergei says, as of right now, they're doing okay, at least as okay as they can be in the situation. Kiev is sort of, they're sort of in almost like a holding pattern, just trying to hold out and hope that the capital does not fall. All these men that he has talked to are I think Sergey is as well, right? Reagan, a graduate of the school. When Roger went to Ukraine in 1990, 91, 92, 93, one of those years. 1993, when they went there, communism had just fallen in the country. Reagan said that even at times they would still have to wait in bread lines just to get bread and things like that. But it was an opportunity, and that's what led Roger to leave Taiwan and go there. And so as part of his work, he spent, Reagan said, 2 years. It was 2 years of dealing with a grumpy dad sometimes, because he made it his job 8 hours a day to spend in classes learning Russian, to speak it, to write it, and to be fluent in it. And it's a good thing, because these brethren that he's talking to, I think he said all but one, they don't speak a lick of English. And so there's no way to communicate with them. And he said 2 or 3 of them have told him as he speaks to them, he uses an app on his phone called Viber, and it's something similar to WhatsApp or something like that. And he said I think multiple ones of them have told him, man, it's great to talk to you, because I could actually speak to you. I could communicate with you. Some of them are having to, they'll put something like in Google Translate and then send it, and you can tell the people that speak that language. And maybe you've gotten something from somebody that was in Spanish or something like that. I get sometimes stuff from brethren in Central America, and I'll put it in Google Translate, and it's kind of like, it just, you can get the sense, but you can tell it's not, just the same. But these are, when he went over there, Roger started a preacher training school, and these are graduates of the preacher training school. And so Sergey is one of those, and he says they're 4 hours south of Kiev, and so far so good. They're doing as well as can be expected. Another graduate's name is Yuri. He's in Kiev, and he's actually in Kiev, and he said they are, again, doing as well as they can. No immediate needs as far as finances. Papa said the easiest thing to do is simply to send money, because with a phone number, he can use something similar to Western Union, but it's called MoneyGram. And he said if he's got their phone number, he can go down there with the funds in hand and fill out some paperwork, give them their phone number, and he said in 10 minutes, they have the funds in their account in the Ukraine. It's pretty amazing. It's like an $8 fee or so, but as of within the last week or so, MoneyGram has waived all fees for any money going to Ukraine or Poland, which I think is a pretty nice gesture on their part. Anybody that's donating or that's sending money to either of those countries, and I think there actually are a few other like refuge type countries that are added to that list, you can wire money totally without a fee. Yuri is there in Kiev, and the other one is Dima, and Papa said he's in a city called Chernovtsi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is the brother that he's on the far west side of Ukraine, bumped up right pretty close to Romania. If you go a little bit north along that border, you'll have the border to Poland, and that's where you hear a lot on the news, people going into Poland. But this brother Dima, he's had a revolving door, anywhere from 40 to 50 people in his home, in the church building. They have a lot of the money that they have sent from Greens Lake Road has gone to help them buy mattresses because people are fleeing. And Romania is one of those countries like Poland that's allowing a lot of folks to come in. Poland, if you've seen on the news, is inundated. I think he said last he had seen something like 3 million, I believe, Ukrainians that had fled into Poland. And it's pretty nice, a gracious gesture from Poland to take in that many refugees. That's a strain on them. And a lot of folks have said that even though that generation, many of them have died, but probably a lot of folks speculate, hey, Poland remembers World War II and how many of their people had to flee for refuge and were taken in by various countries. But anyway, be that as it may, Romania is where Dima is closest to, and they bought a lot of mattresses. Papa said they had sent something like $1,000 at a time as needed, because there are people that will come and they'll stay sometimes 2 or 3 days, and then they go on into Romania. There are some people that come and they stay a week. sometimes 10 days, sometimes 2 weeks. Sometimes they're waiting on their relatives. Sometimes they're waiting on friends. And sometimes they wait, and they're scared to death, wondering, where are they? And sometimes they've been able to meet up, and then they travel together on out. But it's kind of a revolving door. Some people are there longer than that because they're just kind of trying to figure out, what are we going to do? We don't know what to do. There's one brother, and I don't write down the name. I thought I had it, unless it may be that he said the brother Sergei Boykev, that's 4 hours south of Kiev. He may be the one that's somewhere around, I think it was Kharkiv, that has just been obliterated. And the only people there, they said, are either some older folks. They're too stubborn to move, and they just said, this is home. I ain't going anywhere, and I'll be here if they blow up my house. Some folks that are too old, they don't have the health to move. And then some folks that are just there for essential functions of what's left of that city, which is not much. But he did say right now, all these brethren have said that they're good. And he's contacted them. Will you let me know if you have a need? Yes, I will let you know. They anticipate that there will be needs coming up. But he said, as of right now, that's kind of where they are. He said, another thing that they're thinking of is in terms of, they don't want to, he said, I could put out a request, kind of brotherhood-wide or whatever, or even just to a few people on my mailing list, and he said we'd probably have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars coming in. But he said there's probably not a lot of wisdom in dumping that kind of money on these brethren. If nothing else, it could be a temptation to receive all that money at once. You also sometimes might end up with a situation where you got all this extra money and you're trying to contact congregations, well, what do we need to do with this? Because you don't want to feel like, well, they sent it for this, but we've handled that. Can we use it for something else? And you get the idea. But Papo and I were talking, and he said something as a man who he's done, almost 18 years? No, over 20 years total time of, I'm talking located mission work. It's mind-boggling to me. Don't get me wrong, and he was the same way. It is awesome. It is awe-inspiring when you see brethren step up and just deep pockets to help in a situation like this. But he said he was talking to Rod Rutherford. I don't know if you know that name or not, but Rod Rutherford worked for years with Truth for the World. He's been a missionary all over in various places. Rod, I think he's kind of stepped back now with age and health, but as of a few years ago, Rod was preaching for the Gatlinburg Church of Christ. Big A-frame building in Gatlinburg, right there in downtown Gatlinburg. He said he was talking to Rod, and they were talking about this situation. And a few years ago, you remember there was a big fire up there in the Smoky Mountains. That fire got into Gatlinburg, downtown area of Gatlinburg, and one of the buildings that was destroyed was the church building. They received about $1 million of money, insurance money. Wasn't near enough to rebuild the building. Brethren started stepping up. And at one point, they had far more than what they needed to rebuild that building. And so the phone calls started going something like this. Hey, we want to give you some money to help out with that building. And Brother Rutherford would say, well, listen, hey, we really appreciate it. You just wouldn't believe the generosity of our brethren in this effort. But right now we have more than enough to rebuild this building. But let me tell you something. Since you guys have some money obviously available and allocated, I know 2 or 3 missionaries that they're in dire need. These are men I know. I have full confidence in them. They're hardworking, diligent, faithful gospel preachers. Well, no, we're not really interested in that. We just had this. We want to help out with your building. Well, hey, thanks, but look, you can do just as much or more with this if you want to help these. No, thank you. We're good. He said several conversations went like that. Where are the deep pockets to help missionaries? We need to step up in that area as we do in benevolence and helping out when there's some kind of a tragedy. And that's something that I'd like to see more of from the brethren. But leadership, a lot of good leadership seen in Ukraine's leadership, a lot of it seen in the Lord's church over there as they deal with a terrible, terrible tragedy. I was just telling, in fact, Papa asked me to pass it along to Reagan, and I think I told her this, Friday afternoon, but one of those that they were trying to reach, a young lady that was just a couple years older than Reagan, and he said, in fact, I remember, he said, this young lady rode in the car with us to the airport when they left Ukraine. And they couldn't get a hold of her, and Grandma said she was just worried sick and didn't know what had happened, but they finally have spoken to her or heard from her. She finally arrived there on the western side at Dima's place, and that's last he had heard, that's where she's staying. But it's a situation it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. It doesn't look like it's going to let up anytime soon, unfortunately. And your heart goes out to those brethren, and that's what Papa said. He's talking to these people, and he said it's hard not to get emotional when you hear what they're going through, but their attitude is amazing. And so what an example, and in that sense, leadership even from those brethren. But let's kind of I'll move through these quickly because these are the points that we've covered thus far. We just got 3 we want to look at tonight. Leadership lessons from Moses. Moses was a leader with enthusiasm. He had desire, and that's something that's got to be there for leadership. There's a time for persuasion, but you got to desire to be a leader. You're not going to be much of a leader. Training. Got to have training. All of us, no matter how much natural talent we might have, we need some kind of training when it comes to leadership. Courage. Again, this is one that somebody, I think it was Jimmy, mentioned something to me after that sermon that night. Said, look at this president in Ukraine and the courage that he shows, and just the Ukrainian people, the courage. Do you think they're not afraid? I submit to you that probably times they're terrified. But courage is not the absence of fear. It's often stepping up, doing what you need to do in spite of fear. So you got to have courage. A willingness to suffer. Sometimes leaders are going to suffer. Sometimes leaders get targeted by the enemy. You see that in the Ukraine situation, that you see that in a spiritual situation. Let me tell you something. Do you think the devil doesn't put a target, a bounty, as it were, on the backs, on the heads of elders in the Lord's church and others who step up in various leadership roles, whether it be teaching, preaching, serving? You better believe it. You got to have willingness to suffer. Meekness, humility is required. If you're going to be a good leader, you got to be a person who is humble. The leadership is not a place, you see it a lot in so-called leaders, the pride, but that's not a good leader. Wisdom to delegate. That's what we talked about, part of what we talked about last Sunday evening. Got to have some wisdom to delegate lest you burn out. And it also helps to train other leaders as well. A cooperative spirit. It takes teamwork to do great things. Moses had to understand, and he did, he can't do everything all on his own. And then leaders, good leaders, are fair, just, avoiding cronyism. Cronyism, by the way, is, I don't know if we ever actually defined that, but hopefully you kind of picked up from the context. But cronyism is the idea of, somebody that gives special favors to his friends. Nepotism is the idea of somebody giving special favors or preferential treatment to family. Moses avoided both of those. He was fair. He was just. He didn't say, Aaron's going to be my right-hand man because that's my brother in the flesh. He was fair and equitable, and when Aaron did wrong, he would rebuke him the same as anybody else. There's nothing worse than a hypocritical leader that applies one standard to himself, to his family, to his friends, and another standard to other people. Saw this, it was several years ago, so people were criticizing GBN, and there was one of these email lists. They were criticizing GBN, they were criticizing me sometimes, and they were really criticizing it. They kind of went in phases. They get on one of their hobby horses, and the old hobby horses, right? You just back and forth, and that's all you ever do. You don't really go anywhere. Well, that's how some preachers are. They get on some subject, and they just back and forth on that subject, and they don't go anywhere. But they had these different favorite topics. One of them was Apologetics Press. They had an axe to grind for whatever reason with Dave Miller, and so they were just all the time on AP. And I can't believe anybody that would even have AP's material, you must be some kind of liberal. If you even have that stuff in your track rack, you must be some kind of a liberal. And that's what they had kind of implied for a while. Well, finally, on this email list, one guy, he sends an email one day, and he says, "Brethren, I'm really concerned. I have a question." He said, I was at a church event. It was just this past weekend, and this congregation where I went, they had in their track rack, they had some really good, solid material, but they also had these tracks from Apologetics Press. And I looked at them, and everything in them is sound. What do you brethren think about that? And I mean, 2 or 3 guys shot back fast. I mean, quick replies, and they said, they can't be too sound if they got AP stuff in their track rack. Oh man, I don't care if it's sound, just because it says something. Those, they support false teachers. They do this, they do that. And back and forth the guy went, and this fellow that asked the question, he just kind of went silent. And he gave it 2 or 3 days, and he says, I was just curious because what the event I was at was a wedding, and it was at and he named the home congregation of one of the guys who was the most vocal in saying how they must be really, really, really liberal because they got that stuff in their track rack. He said, that's where it was. And oh man, I wish you could have seen it. The backpedaling began. They said, well, now let's just, and they started trying to cover it up. Cronyism. That's all it was. It was cronyism. And they're going to try to justify it because it was their buddy. And now all of a sudden, well, we're not liberal because, but I am going to go and get those tracts out just to be on the safe side. So that's just hypocrisy. Good leadership. You got to be fair and just. Let's talk about, what is this, number 10, approachability. In Exodus chapter 18, if you want to turn there, Exodus 18, 13 through 26, I'm not going to read all these verses again because we read those last week, and I won't just repeat that. I know it's been a week ago, but they're right there if you want to read through these. I just say this to say Moses was an approachable leader. In that context, just to sort of summarize it and remind you, his father-in-law comes to him, Moses' father-in-law, and he watches Moses as he sits all day long judging cases from the people. And he says, Moses, what are you doing? This is not wise. This is a recipe for burnout. You're going to wear yourself out. Appoint leaders over, thousands and hundreds and 50s and so on. Let them judge things. And if they get something that's too difficult, that's a hard case, they can come to you. You go to the Lord. Let me tell you something. I'm not saying you can't lead if you don't learn to delegate, but you talk about taking your leadership to the next level. Some of these guys that are just, unbelievably, what they're accomplishing is just unbelievable. A lot of times it's because they know that they play to their strengths and they delegate the other stuff. And so they're able to get more done in what their strong area is. But part of what led to that for Moses was his being an approachable person. Some leaders think that there's some kind of thing to be desired about being unapproachable. Almost like they want people to be afraid of them, to be afraid to even question them. Look, nobody wants to be looked at, with a sideways glance like, I'm always suspicious of you. But be approachable. Somebody may come up and say, hey, I don't think that's the best way to do it. Okay. Do you have a better idea? And Jethro, Reuel, same person, Moses' father-in-law, he says, yeah, actually I do. And he even goes so far as to say, if God be with you in this thing, if this is God's will, in other words, he says, run it by God, make sure this is the will of the Lord. I don't want to tell you anything that goes against God's will. But he says, I'm telling you, this is a better way. And sure enough, it was. And that's what Moses ended up doing. There's a statement in Job 12, verse 2. Job gets, and poor old Job, the suffering that man went through. And then his friends come and they sit with him for 7 days, just in silence. They sit with him. And they were a comfort to him, no doubt. And it was not original with me, but as one preacher said, you know when Job's trouble began from his friends? When they opened their mouths and they started talking. And so there's a lesson there about speech. But in Job 12 too, Job is just kind of, you just sort of get the feeling he's just so frustrated. And poor old Job with his health situation, where's he going to go? It's not like he can say, you know what, I'm sick of listening to this, y'all. I'm out of here. He's in such agony and terrible suffering, and they just keep on saying, why don't you just repent, Job? Whatever you've done wrong, just repent and make it right, and God will take this suffering away because you really have sinned in a big way to suffer like this. And Job is just constantly just with clenched fists going, no. He's not claiming to be sinless. He's just saying, what? In fact, he, in many ways, when you read the book, he thinks he's done something wrong too. And he's like, I wish God would just come down here and talk to me and tell me what I've done, and then I can make it right. But he gets so frustrated with his friends, and in Job 12:2, he says, no doubt, but ye are the people, and wisdom shall die with you. Now that's what we call in English sarcasm to the nth degree. And that's I guess that's kind of my mom's expression. She used to say that all the time, to the nth degree. That's sarcasm to the nth degree. He says, no doubt, but ye are the people, and wisdom will die with you. In other words, you think you are the man, and you think wisdom's just going to die with you. In other words, you got all the answers. If everybody just shut up and listen to you, right? That's what they thought. But he says that's not the case. And let me make us a promise, starting with old Chad here, but I can tell you it's the same for you and every single one of us. Wisdom is not going to die with any one of us. And if we would sometimes be approachable and just listen as leaders, whether it's a leader in the home, a leader in the church, a leader in the workplace, if we'd be approachable, kind of an open door policy, that's kind of a popular term a lot of times in the business world, and it's so funny to me. I've worked in the secular workplace, and sometimes it's one of those phrases they just throw out. Open door policy. And I'm like, you worked for a few months, a year, a few years with some of these supervisors, bosses, whomever it may be, and you're like, you don't have an open door policy at all. You just talk about it. And so don't just talk about being approachable, but be approachable. And understand wisdom's not going to die with any of us, and be a lot better leaders for it. You have people that will say, wow, that so-and-so, he knows how to listen. And if there's a suggestion that actually makes things better, he'll take it. And he'll implement it. She'll take it, she'll implement it. And it'll become better. I mean, even within the home. Moms, it may be that children say something and, that we understand there are some times that there are some things, and, I grew up hearing it the same as anybody else. Sometimes there's something, mom says, dad says, it's because I say so. And I'm under their roof and under their rules. Put my feet under their table, sleep in a bed in their house, I'm under their rules. But are there not times when maybe we could listen and say, you know what? Okay, that might be not too bad of an idea. Approachability makes us a better leader. Moses was approachable. Let's notice next here, number 11 in our total list. Care, love. There can be no doubt. You can say what you want about Moses. You may say, I like his leadership style, or there are things that I like, things that I don't like, but one thing you cannot do is question his love for his people. In fact, in Exodus chapter 2, this is kind of where things kind of begin. You see his desire here, but it's a lot of it is his passionate zeal for his people. He grew up in the house of Pharaoh, but he knows I'm no Israelite, or I'm no Egyptian. He knows I'm an Israelite. Those are my people, not the Egyptians. And so he sees an Egyptian picking on, bullying an Israelite. Sees this Egyptian smiting in Hebrew, verse 11, one of his brethren. Don't lose sight of that phrase. It was a Hebrew, but it was one of his brethren. He said, that's my brother. Remember that song? What was it from I think the 70s? He ain't heavy. He's my brother. And Moses is like, that's one of my brethren. He looked this way and that way, saw there was no man. He slew the Egyptian, hit him in the sand. I'm not saying that the right thing to do was just to whack this guy and take him out. But you see that love, that zeal for his people. And of course, it ends up being known, verse 13 and 14, verses 13 and 14. And he has to flee. And God is still, though, in spite of that, it wasn't the best choice by Moses, but God still manages to use that. And Moses, goes through some leadership training out in the wilderness, right, out in the desert as he begins to tend sheep. But his love for Israel, his brethren, was unquestionable. Fast forward to Exodus 32. Moses is on the mount, receiving the law, Mount Sinai, and, the people just decide, well, Moses is just gone. So, Aaron, what are we going to do? Moses just disappeared on us. Aaron says, bring me all your gold. And as he recounts this later to Moses, you talk about not the best leadership in so many different ways there from Aaron. Not just to pick on him, but he was lacking in so many ways, at least in this particular incident. And he tells Moses what? Well, the people brought me their gold, and I threw it in the fire, and out jumped this calf. Don't take people for fools. That's another leadership tip we could give from looking at Aaron's foolishness. Moses, you can almost see Moses going, come on, man, I'm not a dummy. But the Lord tells Moses that the people are a stiff-necked people. He'd already told him just up in verse 7, get thee down. Thy people which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They're worshiping a golden calf. And so in verse 9, God says, you know what? I'm done. Sometimes we would say, maybe in our modern vernacular, I'm over this. This people, they're stiff-necked, they're stubborn, in other words. Let me alone. Let my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them. God says, I got a solution for this. I can finish them, wipe them out, and start over. But you know what he says? The last part of that verse, was that verse 10? And I will make of thee, Moses, a great nation. I've said it before. There are some folks to this very day that would go, that doesn't sound so bad, God. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better place to start. They might not come out and say it in those words, but that's their mentality, right? That's their attitude. Oh, you couldn't find a much better person to make a great nation from than me, Lord. Not Moses. Again, you see the humility, but also the love here for his people. Moses besought the Lord his God and said, Lord, why doth thy wrath wax hot against thy people, which thou hast brought forth out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? He doesn't say, oh, don't do this to my people. Now, they were his people in the sense that he considered himself one of them, but he reminds God, these are your people. Wherefore should the Egyptians speak and say, for mischief did he bring them out, to slay them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from thy fierce wrath and repent of this evil against thy people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, thy servants, to whom thou swearest by thine own self, and saidst unto them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of will I give unto your seed, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord repented. We would say, and I think the New King James and other versions have it, relented. It's not moral repentance in the sense that he did wrong. It's just saying he changed his mind. He relented of the evil. And again, that's a word that simply means calamity, which he thought to do unto his people. Not moral evil that God was going to do. So he relented or changed his mind from this calamity that he was going to bring. You see a similar instance in Numbers chapter 14. They've sent these spies into the land to spy it out, and they come back and they say, man, the land is everything God said, and then some, but there are giants in the land. We can't take it. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. We don't stand a chance. All the things that people no doubt would have said in that situation. And Joshua and Caleb try to, no, stop. And of course, you learn from that sometimes good leaders aren't listened to no matter what. Joshua and Caleb were great leaders. And in fact, Joshua's going to come into his own after Moses dies. But the people just weren't listening. You had the influence of those other 10 spies. And so God says, Numbers 14, verse 11, how long will this people provoke me? How long will it be ere they believe me for all the signs which I've showed among them? It's not like they haven't seen signs, right, to know that God's power. He says, I will smite them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and will make of thee, Moses, a greater nation and mightier than they. Here's another chance for Moses. Start over with just him. Moses, again, intercedes and begs God. Oh, you don't want people in the land to talk about this, how you were going to bring them into the land, and now you just left them out here in the wilderness. And, Moses looks at it from the standpoint of this might cause people to speak questionably or ill of Jehovah. So he intercedes for the people. Bottom line here, great leaders love those they lead, period. If you don't love the people you're leading, do them a favor, do yourself a favor, and get out of that leadership position. You got to love those that you lead. Hebrews 13:17 talks about obey them that have the rule over you. He's talking about elders there, of course. And submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. The elders, it is assumed there that in the congregational setting of elders, they love the flock. And so he says, allow them to oversee you with joy. I sometimes read that verse and I think about that. Does my work in the church make it so that my elders, when they sit down and if my name should come up in an elders meeting and they say, I don't have to worry about him, he's going to do what he's supposed to do. If he says he's going to do something, he's going to get it done. He's going to do it. He's going to do it diligently. He's going to do the best that he can. He's going to be faithful to the Lord. I don't want to be somebody that if they're sitting in the meeting, they say, well, he said he was going to do it. I hope that he'll follow through. He said he'll do it. I don't know when it's going to get done. Where's he been lately? I haven't heard anything from him. Hasn't said he's sick. Hasn't said he's been, what's going on? That they may do it with joy, not with grief. Because you know what the Hebrews writer says? Ultimately, that's unprofitable, not for the elders, but for you. It's win-win if we make it so that the elders can oversee us with joy. John 10:11-13, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. Special application here to shepherding in the sense of spiritual shepherding. He goes on and says, he that is an hireling, not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming and leaveth the sheep and fleeth. And the wolf catcheth them and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth because he is an hireling and careth not for the sheep. Do we love those that we lead, or are we just a hireling? That's ultimately the question. And then finally, for Moses' life, great leaders are selfless. They have selflessness. Moses always called Israel, we pointed out just a moment ago, God's people. Thy people, Lord. It wasn't about Moses. It was about the people and about God. Great leaders, they don't care who gets the credit. 1 Corinthians 3:6-7, where Paul says, I've planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And then he goes on, he says, so then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Forget about who plants, who waters, who baptized this person, who baptized that person. Paul says, who cares? It's not about that. It is about getting souls from in the world translated into the kingdom where they're going to heaven. That's what's important. He says ultimately God's given the increase because it's God's word that does the converting. And he says, leaders, whether you're an apostle, whether you're a preacher, an elder, Bible class teacher, in whatever area we are, ultimately every single one of us as humans, we are stewards. And it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 2. Nelson Mandela said this: "It is better to lead from behind and to put others in front, especially when you celebrate victory, when nice things occur. You take the front line when there is danger. Then people will appreciate your leadership." That is a servant leadership mentality. So look, if there's danger, I'll stand in the front and I'll take the first shots. But when there's victory, you go on ahead and you march and receive that credit. You see, that's selfless leadership. Man, you see that with Jesus. When it came time to die on the cross to deal with the sin problem, he's out front and he says, "Father, thy will be done. Take away this cup if it's possible, but your will be done." And he went to the cross. But it's all about serving those that he leads. What a great, great example of leadership in Moses. I used our new view board to try out something here. I could screen mirror my iPad, that image from the front, and then I just tried to, I just hand wrote on there, and then you can save the image. But I wanted something, I was having trouble getting it all to fit or look just like I wanted it to look with using text on PowerPoint, so I just thought, I'm just going to try this, see how it looks. It looks like somebody wrote on it by hand, but it works. Those are all 12 of these points that we've looked at in the life of Moses that combined to make him such a tremendous leader. What a great man of God Moses was. Perfect? No. But he knew how to lead, and he knew that great leadership begins with leaning on the everlasting arms of the Lord. He was a man who was dependent on God. He didn't, great leaders, great people, this goes for people, period. Don't try to do things alone. Don't try to go it alone. Don't try to lead alone. Don't try to live alone. And that's why Paul says, 1 Corinthians 10:12, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." I think when you look at that in context, what he's saying there, it's an elliptical state, but the people had become idolatrous because they think Moses, he's just disappeared. We're all by ourselves down here at the foot of the mountain. Where'd Moses go? I don't know. Just us. Make us a calf. And so he says, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth alone," to fill the ellipsis, "take heed lest he fall." And so you have Paul saying in 1 Corinthians 9:27, "I keep under my body, bring it into subjection, lest by any means when I've preached to others, I myself should be cast away." We have to learn to lean. Going back to some of the stuff that we talked about with the situation there in Ukraine, one of the things that Roger told me that he's been so amazed by with the brethren is their attitude in the whole thing, their trust in God. And he said that there's a phrase that is very popular in Ukraine, and it's something like Slava or Slavic Ukraine. Glory to the Ukraine. And he told me, he said, you may have even heard that on the news. I don't know that I had heard that before, but sometimes you'll hear people saying that in some of the interviews or broadcasts or things like that. But he said every one of the brethren that he has corresponded with over there or spoken to on the Viber app or something like that, they say a little bit of a variation on that phrase. I don't know that I'm going to pronounce it right, but I'll do the best that I can. It's something like Slavic Bohu. In other words, glory to God. Not that they're not proud of their country. It's not that they don't have patriotic pride in their country, especially in such a situation. But they say, all glory goes to God. One of the brethren, Roger said, told him, we're okay. We're blessed in many ways, even in spite of the situation. But he says, I think about it sometimes and I think, what's the worst case scenario? We get killed and we're going home. These are brothers and sisters in Christ that have obeyed the gospel. And he said, you're telling me the worst scenario The worst scenario is I go home to my eternal reward. And he said, Brother Roger, that doesn't sound so bad. What an attitude. What about us? As we close out tonight, are we where we need to be? You know, as we've said several times, leading others begins with making sure I've led myself and I'm in the right relationship with God at any given time. Can we help you with that in some way? Maybe you have questions about that, need to know more, want to explore that further, study about that further. Well, we stand ready, willing, and able to help you in whatever way, getting right with God, staying right with God, and that's why the invitation is extended. Hark the gentle voice of Jesus calleth. Will you come and respond to him? We can help you. Won't you come while we stand and sing?